When Sophia Bennett appeared at the reception lobby of the Miami-Dade Police Department on a sweltering morning, she was almost unrecognizable, gaunt, trembling, clothes disheveled as if she had just stepped out of a forgotten place. The woman who had vanished 19 months earlier from a peaceful residential area in Miami Beach, the one her husband had once reported missing in a broken, desperate voice, had suddenly returned like a living ghost. But what left the investigators stunned wasn't the fact that Sophia was still alive. The most terrifying part lay in what she said about those 19 months, about the marriage that had seemed perfect, about the place where she had been kept hidden from the world, and about the person who had been by her side the entire time. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the morning of November 14, 2014, the residential area along Alton Road in South Beach, Miami Beach, woke up to the familiar atmosphere of an ordinary day, where the early sunlight reflected off the still dewy pavement and the low-rise buildings stood quietly amid the sparse traffic of rush hour. In a small apartment overlooking the main road, Sophia Bennett, 26 years old, began her day following the exact routine that had repeated for many months since she married her husband, Adrian Petrov. Sophia's life was considered stable, a steady job, a new marriage, and no signs that she was facing any crisis big enough to disrupt that daily order. That morning unfolded so normally that it left no particular impression. Sophia prepared to leave for work, dressed neatly, carrying her purse and phone as usual, showing no signs of haste or anxiety, no arguments, and no sounds or indications that she was forced to leave the apartment. According to later confirmed data, Sophia's final known route showed nothing unusual. She left the apartment complex on Alton Road, followed the familiar path toward the central Miami Beach area, a route she had traveled nearly every day, by the usual means, and at the usual time, with no evidence that she turned in a different direction or changed plans at the last minute. Throughout the morning, and into the early afternoon, everything appeared to proceed as a normal workday for thousands of others in the city, and Sophia's absence was not immediately seen as cause for concern. However, as time passed, and the afternoon drew to a close, Sophia did not return at her usual hour, an absence at first viewed only as a minor delay, since she occasionally came home late due to work or traffic. But as darkness began to fall, and the first calls went unanswered, that delay gradually turned into an inexplicable void. Sophia's phone could not be reached, messages sent received no response, and there was no information from her workplace or friends, indicating she had changed plans for the day. Time continued to stretch in silence, hour after hour, passing without any sign of Sophia's whereabouts or condition, causing her absence to move far beyond the bounds of an ordinary busy day. When night fell, the apartment on Alton Road remained empty, and the silence in that familiar space began to take on a different tone, heavy and uneasy. There was no sign Sophia had returned while her husband waited, no sound of the door opening, no lights turning on in the room that had grown so accustomed to the rhythm of the two of them. After many hours of futile attempts to make contact, with no way left to explain the sudden disappearance of the wife who had left home that morning, showing every sign of complete normalcy, Adrian Petrov picked up the phone and called the Miami Beach police to report her missing. His voice trembling, halting, and filled with anguish, marking the moment when the silence of an ordinary day officially became the starting point of an unexplained disappearance. Right after Adrian Petrov's missing person call that night, the Miami Beach police received the information and proceeded to open a missing persons file for Sophia Bennett, treating it as an urgent verification case, but at that point not yet having enough elements to classify it as a serious crime. A task force was dispatched to the apartment on Alton Road during the late-night hours to carry out preliminary checks, focusing on assessing the condition of the scene where Sophia was last confirmed to have left. The apartment was noted to be in an orderly state, with no signs of forced entry through the door or windows, no furniture displaced, no traces of a struggle detected, and no indications whatsoever that any coercive act had taken place in the shared living space. Investigators went through each functional area of the apartment, from the living room and bedroom to the kitchen and bathroom, to confirm there were no signs of unauthorized entry or physical confrontation, while also recording that all everyday items were in their normal state, consistent with the scenario of Sophia leaving home that morning to go to work as usual. The absence of any signs of violence at the residence temporarily ruled out the hypothesis of an abduction occurring inside the apartment, and the focus of verification shifted to the possibility that the disappearance took place outside the residential area. In parallel with the scene examination, police gathered detailed personal information on Sophia Bennett to complete the missing persons file, including her age, occupation, marital status, length of residence in Miami Beach, as well as necessary identifying data for the National Missing Persons System. Initial data showed that Sophia had led a relatively stable life, with no history of running away, no recorded diagnoses of psychological disorders in public medical records, no involvement in legal disputes, debts, or complicated relationships that could explain a sudden decision to leave. Police also documented Sophia's daily habits through statements from her husband and available information, including the time she left home each morning, the usual route she took to work, her typical return time in the afternoon or evening, and her regular after-work activities, in order to determine whether anything on the day of her disappearance differed from her normal routine. In the process of verifying Sophia's schedule on the day she went missing, police contacted her workplace to check whether she had shown up at the office the last time she was seen by colleagues, and whether there had been any unusual behavior that morning. This verification aimed to reconstruct the precise timeline of the day Sophia disappeared, from the moment she left the apartment on Alton Road until the point when she was confirmed to be out of contact, while also helping to narrow down the window of time during which the disappearance could have occurred. The familiar routes Sophia usually took were also initially reviewed, including the main thoroughfares in South Beach and surrounding areas, with the goal of determining whether any information indicated she had deviated from her daily path, though at this stage the review was primarily for data verification rather than an expanded search. Throughout these initial verification steps, Adrian Petrov was considered the primary point of contact for information about Sophia's routines and habits, and he was invited to cooperate with police right at the apartment. Adrian displayed a cooperative attitude, answering questions about the last morning Sophia left home, confirming that no notable arguments or conflicts had occurred before she went to work, and describing how he began to worry when Sophia did not return on time and could not be reached for several consecutive hours. The information Adrian provided during this phase was recorded as consistent with the scene and the initial data collected by police, with no clear contradictions or signs of evading questions, meaning he did not immediately become a suspect in the absence of evidence indicating criminal behavior. Police also noted Adrian's emotional state in those early hours, observing him as stressed and panicked, consistent with the reaction of someone who had just realized their wife had gone missing under unusual circumstances, but not sufficient to draw any investigative conclusions beyond the scope of initial verification. With the facts gathered during this phase, Sophia Bennett's case was handled as a disappearance of unknown cause, in which the police's focus was on completing the file, verifying personal information, daily habits, and the schedule on the day of disappearance, while maintaining regular contact with Adrian Petrov for updates, and keeping all hypotheses open due to the lack of specific signs pointing to any scenario that could be confirmed with certainty. In the days following the establishment of Sophia Bennett's missing persons file, the Miami Beach police expanded the search radius beyond the apartment on Alton Road, launching broad-scale search operations in South Beach and surrounding areas where Sophia might have passed through on the day she disappeared. Patrol teams, in coordination with local search units, checked public spaces, parking lots, beachfront parks, canal-side areas, and frequently trafficked roads, while support units scoured less noticeable locations, including back alleys behind residential complexes, vacant lots, and areas under infrastructure construction. In parallel with the physical searches, investigators began collecting and reviewing data from public surveillance cameras and traffic cameras in the area, focusing on the main routes leading out of South Beach, major intersections, and points where Sophia might have appeared in the time after leaving the apartment. This review aimed to determine whether any footage captured Sophia's movement, the vehicle she might have used, or any signs that she had been with someone else, but the results were fragmented and did not form a continuous sequence of images sufficient to establish a clear direction of travel. Traffic cameras recorded heavy vehicle flow during the morning rush hour, but provided no direct evidence showing that Sophia had left the area in a specific vehicle or along an unusual route. Efforts to verify Sophia's means of transportation also yielded no breakthroughs, as there was no data indicating she had used a personal vehicle, and public transportation in the area did not store passenger information at a level detailed enough to trace a specific individual. While the search and data review efforts continued, police found no body, discovered no decisive physical evidence, and had no direct witnesses who could confirm seeing Sophia in a dangerous situation or under duress after she left home. The information gathered was primarily eliminative rather than confirmatory, gradually narrowing down hypotheses, but not sufficient to solidify any specific scenario about how or where Sophia had disappeared. In that context, local media attention began to turn toward the case, and Adrian Petrov appeared publicly in his role as the husband who had lost his wife, participating in brief exchanges with the press to appeal for community assistance and express hope for information about Sophia's whereabouts. Adrian's image during this period was noted as consistent with that of a grieving family member awaiting news. He appeared anxious, expressed unease over the lack of clear leads, and repeatedly emphasized that Sophia had never shown any signs of wanting to abandon her current life. These public statements did not contain information that contradicted what he had previously told police, and in the absence of specific evidence, they did not provide grounds to place him under suspicion. As time passed and search efforts produced no results, Sophia's file began to be viewed under a more serious lens, since a prolonged disappearance with no signs of contact or reappearance anywhere raised the possibility that a crime had occurred. Investigators noted that the absence of a body did not rule out the risk of violent involvement, while the lack of direct witnesses meant all hypotheses had to rely on indirect inference and the systematic elimination of possibilities. The status of the file was adjusted to missing person, suspected foul play, reflecting the increased seriousness of the case without definitively confirming the nature of any crime that may have occurred. However, even with the classification change, the investigation remained at a standstill due to the lack of strong new leads to drive further steps, and data reviews along with physical searches gradually decreased in frequency over time. After many months with no significant progress, Sophia Bennett's case was transitioned to cold case status, meaning the file was archived pending any new information or evidence in the future, while the questions about where and how she had disappeared continued to linger in the void that prior search efforts had been unable to fill. 19 months after Sophia Bennett's missing persons file had been placed into archived status due to no new leads, on an ordinary morning at the Miami-Dade Police Department headquarters, routine operations were underway when a woman appeared at the reception area. She had a gaunt frame, slightly hunched shoulders, wore old and weather-inappropriate clothing, with disheveled hair and pallid skin that indicated prolonged physical deterioration. This woman carried no identification documents, did not request emergency medical assistance, showed no signs of agitation or panic, and simply waited quietly for her turn to be processed, her gaze focused but weary. When the duty officer asked for her name and purpose for coming in, she identified herself as Sophia Bennett and stated that she had been missing for a long time, while also requesting to speak directly with the investigator assigned to her case, emphasizing that the matter she needed to discuss related to a previously frozen file. Given the unusual nature of this information, the duty officer quickly checked the internal system and found that the name Sophia Bennett matched exactly with an unresolved missing persons file, currently in cold case status. This information was immediately reported up to the shift commander, and the decision was made to escort the woman to a private work area to ensure security and control the situation. During the initial intake process, staff clearly noted that Sophia's physical condition differed significantly from the data on record in the old file, including drastic weight loss, signs of chronic sleep deprivation, slow and deliberate movements, and faint marks on her wrists and forearms consistent with prolonged restriction of movement, although no open wounds or recent signs of violence were observed at the time of her appearance. Sophia did not attempt to avoid intake procedures, answering necessary questions for initial identity verification briefly and accurately, but she refused to provide detailed information about the period of her disappearance in the public area, insisting that she was only willing to explain when speaking directly with an investigator in a private setting. This demeanor was recorded as calm, purposeful, and consistent, not consistent with the behavior of a transient person or someone who had voluntarily run away and just returned. Recognizing that Sophia's physical condition showed signs of exhaustion but was not in immediate danger, police conducted an on-site preliminary medical assessment to ensure she was fit to participate in questioning, while also noting that her current signs suggested she may have endured a prolonged period of control or restricted freedom. While awaiting necessary administrative procedures, Sophia was seated in a separate workroom, not handcuffed, not subjected to any coercive measures, and provided with water and basic needs, but she did not request contact with family, friends, or any other individuals. Sophia's direct appearance at the police headquarters, in a physical state, indicating long-term deterioration, and with a clear request to work with investigators, was assessed as a decisive development for a case that had previously been considered stalled. Information about her return was quickly forwarded to the investigative unit that had originally handled the missing persons file, and after reviewing the initial factors, the unit commander made the official decision to reactivate Sophia Bennett's cold case file, meaning all data, documents, and reports related to the prior disappearance were retrieved from the archive system to support subsequent verification steps. This decision was not based on detailed statements from Sophia at that moment, but on the match between her identity, her current physical condition, and the unresolved nature of the previous file, in a context where her very appearance was sufficient on its own to completely change the legal status of the case. While investigators were reassigned and internal procedures were activated, Sophia continued to maintain a quiet demeanor, not volunteering additional information beyond necessary confirmations, and waited in the separate workspace, where her presence, after 19 months of complete absence from any official trace, had forced the investigative system to shift from passive archive status to a new phase of active operation. After the decision to reactivate the cold case file was made, identity verification procedures for the woman claiming to be Sophia Bennett were carried out according to standard protocol, beginning with the collection of biometric data to compare against previously stored information. Sophia's fingerprints were taken and entered into the national system, where the dataset collected from the time she handled administrative procedures before disappearing remained on file, and the comparison results showed a complete match, ruling out any possibility of mistaken identity or impersonation. In parallel, police compared other biological data, including facial features, height, bone structure, and physical characteristics recorded in the old file, all of which aligned with her current measurements, even though Sophia's physical condition had significantly deteriorated compared to before her disappearance. Personal identifying features that are not easily altered, such as a small scar on her forearm, congenital skin marks, and other physical characteristics documented in prior medical records, were also checked and confirmed, further reinforcing the conclusion that the woman present at the police headquarters was indeed Sophia Bennett, the subject of the missing persons file established 19 months earlier. To complete legal identity verification, the medical department was requested to provide Sophia's basic health records from the healthcare facilities she had accessed before disappearing, in order to match information related to medical history, blood type, and other medical data, and the results showed consistency between the archived records and her current condition, although her health indicators had shifted negatively due to prolonged exhaustion. Legal confirmation of Sophia Bennett's identity was finalized once all necessary comparison steps yielded matching results, allowing police to officially recognize that the victim of the cold case had returned and was physically present to work with authorities. As soon as her identity was confirmed, the entire investigative file related to Sophia's disappearance was fully reopened, not just in terms of retrieving information, but also through reassigning personnel, restoring old reports, and re-establishing the timelines that had previously been constructed. Investigators reviewed all data collected during the early phase of the case, from the apartment scene inspection reports, search operation reports, traffic camera data, to records of Adrian Petrov's public activities during the time Sophia was missing, in preparation for cross-referencing with any new information that might emerge from her return. During the file reopening process, a decisive change was noted. The legal nature of the case was no longer being considered solely as a disappearance of unknown cause, because Sophia's appearance in a physical state showing signs of prolonged exhaustion and restricted freedom provided grounds to consider the possibility of serious criminal activity. Investigative commanders agreed that a missing person returning after 19 months, with physical and psychological signs inconsistent with voluntary flight, required redirecting the case evaluation toward a stricter framework. On that basis, the file's classification was updated, shifting from missing person status to suspected abduction and unlawful confinement, although at this point there was no official conclusion regarding the perpetrator or the method of the offense. This decision triggered the application of different investigative procedures, including heightened information security, restricted file access for individuals not directly involved, and preparation of the necessary steps to formally record Sophia's statement in a manner with legal evidentiary value. While administrative and investigative procedures were restarted, Sophia was informed that her identity had been confirmed, and her file was no longer in archive status, and she was explained the next steps within the current legal framework, but at this point, she had still not provided any detailed statement about the period of her disappearance. The legal confirmation of Sophia Bennett's identity and the full reopening of the investigative file created a solid legal foundation for the case to be re-examined from the beginning, not as an unsolved disappearance, but as a potential criminal case, in which the victim's return served as the pivotal factor, forcing the investigative system to adjust its approach and prepare for a deeper verification process based on new data arising directly from her presence. After Sophia Bennett's identity was legally confirmed, and the investigative file was reopened, she was moved into a comprehensive medical evaluation process to determine her current health status, as well as to document any signs that might relate to the prolonged period of her disappearance. The general examination was conducted in order of priority, starting with basic vital signs such as blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, and body temperature, which showed that Sophia was not in immediate danger, but had several indicators outside the normal range for a healthy adult. Her weight was significantly lower than the medical data on file before her disappearance, with reduced body fat percentage and markedly decreased muscle mass, reflecting prolonged malnutrition rather than acute weight loss. Initial blood tests revealed deficiencies in several essential micronutrients, along with biochemical markers consistent with chronic exhaustion, commonly seen in individuals who have endured extended periods of stress, combined with restricted living conditions. During the medical history intake, Sophia did not report any serious chronic illnesses prior to her disappearance, and her old medical records also showed no conditions that could independently lead to the current level of deterioration in such a short time frame, reinforcing the assessment that her physical decline was cumulative over time. Doctors evaluated her sleep deprivation through clinical interview and observation of neurological signs, noting prominent dark circles under her eyes, slowed reflexes, and reduced concentration, indicators typically associated with prolonged sleep disruption or inadequate rest over an extended period. Although Sophia did not provide details about her living circumstances during the missing period at the time of evaluation, these manifestations indicated that the sleep deprivation was not a short-term recent phenomenon, but the result of a process lasting weeks or months. Indirect physical damage assessment was also performed through examination of the musculoskeletal system, skin and soft tissues, revealing some faint indentations and calluses in areas commonly subject to repeated pressure or friction. Consistent with restricted movement in confined spaces or uncomfortable positions, but no fractures, dislocations or acute internal organ injuries were found. Doctors paid particular attention to the absence of recent acute injuries around the time of Sophia's reappearance, including no new bruises, no healing skin lacerations, and no signs of recent head trauma or concussion, indicating she had not just experienced a serious violent event immediately before appearing at the police headquarters. The lack of acute injuries was not considered evidence ruling out past violence, but was noted as a factor, showing that Sophia's current physical condition resulted from prolonged and continuous impacts, rather than a single short-term incident. Additional tests were ordered to rule out infection, poisoning, or other acute medical conditions, and initial results showed no evidence of pathologies that could directly explain the current state of exhaustion, without involving adverse environmental or living circumstances. In the comprehensive medical report, doctors noted that the combination of malnutrition, exhaustion, sleep deprivation, and signs of prolonged restricted movement formed a clinical picture consistent with an individual having spent a long time under controlled or deprived living conditions, rather than a free lifestyle with full self-care capability. The medical conclusion did not make judgments about legal causation or criminal responsibility, but determined that Sophia Bennett's health condition was unlikely to have developed in a normal, independent living context, and was compatible with the possibility of prolonged confinement or restricted freedom during the period of her disappearance. This report was forwarded to the investigative unit as expert documentation to support evaluation of the case's nature, while also serving as a basis for subsequent decisions regarding Sophia's health assurance, safety, and ability to participate in proceedings within the legal framework. As she continued to receive medical monitoring and necessary support to stabilize her condition after the long period of deterioration. After the medical evaluation process confirmed Sophia Bennett's prolonged physical deterioration, an in-depth psychological assessment was implemented to determine her current mental state, as well as her capacity to participate in legal proceedings without causing further harm. The evaluation was conducted by a forensic psychologist experienced in working with victims who had endured prolonged confinement or control, using a combination of clinical interviews, behavioral observation, and standard screening tools to assess the level of trauma. Throughout the session, Sophia displayed a high state of alertness, reacting strongly to unexpected stimuli, such as loud noises or sudden changes in the environment, while also tending to maintain a clear physical distance from the person she was speaking with, manifestations commonly seen in cases of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The experts noted that Sophia's reactions were not dramatic or out of control, but presented as sustained baseline tension, with tightly controlled emotions, a steady but inflexible voice, and eyes that frequently scanned the surrounding environment, as if assessing the level of safety. During the assessment, Sophia showed clear signs of complex PTSD, including a persistent sense of insecurity, a tendency towards self-blame, difficulty relaxing even in an environment identified as safe, and strong psychological reactions when topics related to control, confinement, or loss of autonomy were mentioned. The experts paid particular attention to how Sophia responded to control-oriented questions, when she tended to become more tense, with shallower and slower breathing during responses, indicating that her nervous system remained in a state of heightened vigilance, consistent with individuals who had experienced long-term behavioral and environmental control. However, despite the evident trauma signs, Sophia retained the ability to orient to time, place, and person, accurately answering questions about the date, current location, and the roles of those participating in the evaluation, showing no signs of psychosis or severe cognitive impairment. When assessed for stability and providing testimony, Sophia demonstrated the ability to maintain focus over short to medium periods, though she required breaks to regulate emotions and reduce tension, an observation recorded as consistent with her current psychological state and not indicative of avoidance or non-cooperation. The experts also evaluated the impact of psychological trauma on memory and the ability to sequence events, noting that Sophia could clearly recall specific details tied to strong emotions or survival elements, but struggled to reconstruct a continuous timeline or long periods without clear event markers, a feature commonly seen in those who have endured prolonged trauma. These memory gaps were not assessed as signs of fabrication or dishonesty, but as consistent with protective psychological mechanisms in which the brain prioritizes remembering elements directly related to personal safety in the context of extended threat. The experts noted that eliciting statements from Sophia needed to be done in a structured manner, avoiding pressure, allowing her to self-pace, and employing supportive techniques to help her gradually reorganize the sequence of events. In the assessment conclusion, the expert team determined that although Sophia Bennett was clearly affected by complex PTSD and psychological responses related to prolonged control, she maintained sufficient psychological stability to provide legally valuable testimony, provided that the statement-taking process was conducted in a safe, controlled environment, tailored to her psychological state. The report emphasized that limitations in memory or inconsistent emotional displays during questioning should be understood in the context of trauma and not interpreted as signs of unreliability, and that overall, Sophia's cognitive capacity, orientation, and reality awareness allowed her to participate reliably in the investigation with appropriate psychological support. This conclusion was forwarded to the investigative unit as expert guidance to shape the approach to Sophia's statements, ensuring both the collection of necessary information to clarify the case and the minimization of the risk of re-traumatization for the victim during the process. After the medical and psychological evaluations confirmed that Sophia Bennett had sufficient physical and mental capacity to participate in working with investigative authorities, a phase to determine the legal nature of the case's actions was conducted, with the focus on clarifying whether the 19-month prolonged disappearance was voluntary or involuntary. In the structured confirmation process, Sophia firmly and consistently stated that she did not run away, did not voluntarily leave her married life, did not attempt to cut off contact with society, and had no actions intended to conceal her identity or change her residence for personal reasons. She confirmed that at the time of her disappearance, she was still maintaining her job, stable social relationships, and had no plans to leave Miami Beach or her marriage, thereby ruling out the hypothesis of voluntary disappearance that had been considered in the early stages of the file. On the basis of this confirmation, investigators shifted to determining whether Sophia's disappearance constituted criminal conduct, particularly serious violations of personal freedom. Sophia confirmed that she had been abducted and subsequently unlawfully confined for a long period, not permitted to move freely, without access to means of communication, and subjected to comprehensive control over her living environment, daily activities, and personal decisions. This confirmation was not presented as an emotional declaration, but was delivered within a controlled working framework, consistent with the previously documented physical and psychological manifestations, including prolonged exhaustion, psychological reactions to control, and signs consistent with long-term restriction of freedom. When asked to identify the perpetrator of the criminal acts, Sophia explicitly named Adrian Petrov, her legal husband, as the primary suspect and affirmed that the entire process of abduction and confinement occurred within the context of their marital relationship, with no involvement from any external parties. Identifying Adrian Petrov as the primary suspect marked a major turning point in the investigation, as he had previously been regarded as the direct family member who reported her missing, cooperated with police, and was not under suspicion due to the lack of clear criminal indicators. Sophia's confirmation forced the investigative agency to re-examine the entire file from a completely different perspective, in which Adrian's actions, statements, and behaviors throughout the time Sophia was considered missing were reframed in the context of power dynamics, control, and the potential to conceal criminal conduct within the family space. From a legal standpoint, identifying abduction and unlawful confinement within a marriage shifted the investigation toward serious domestic crimes, where perpetrators often exploit trust, privacy, and societal norms around married life to carry out and conceal offenses over extended periods. Investigators noted that the pattern of behavior described by Sophia aligned with forms of coercive control crimes, in which violence does not necessarily manifest openly or continuously, but is replaced by isolation, psychological control, and the gradual stripping away of the victim's autonomy. This redirection of the investigation brought about a fundamental change in the approach to the file, as the focus was no longer on searching for a missing person, but on determining the structure, motive, and operational mechanism of a prolonged criminal act within the family sphere. On that basis, a new investigative axis was established, centering on the relationship between Sophia Bennett and Adrian Petrov, concentrating on reconstructing the sequence of events from the period before the disappearance, the moment of the abduction, through the entire duration of confinement. This investigative axis required re-reviewing timelines, statements, social activities, and Adrian's interactions throughout the time Sophia was absent, as well as reassessing elements previously considered normal or consistent with the role of a worried husband, but which could now carry different implications when viewed in the context of suspected abduction and coercive control. The determination of criminal conduct in this phase was not based on a single factor, but resulted from the convergence of Sophia's consistent confirmation, the medical and psychological conclusions, and a comprehensive re-evaluation of the marital relationship through the lens of power and control, thereby laying the legal foundation for treating the case no longer as an unexplained disappearance, but as a serious criminal case involving abduction and unlawful confinement, with Adrian Petrov identified as the central suspect in the new investigative direction. In the process of clarifying the criminal motive, the investigative agency conducted an in-depth analysis of the marital relationship between Sophia Bennett and Adrian Petrov in the period leading up to her disappearance, based on Sophia's statements, data collected from the old file, and cross-referencing with information about their shared life. The facts showed that this relationship began in a stable context, presenting the image of a young married couple living in Miami Beach, maintaining jobs, social activities, and with no recorded history of serious conflicts in administrative or legal records. However, over time, Adrian's behavior began to shift toward increasingly evident control, manifested through frequently monitoring Sophia's schedule, repeatedly questioning her personal relationships, and requiring her to provide detailed explanations for everyday activities that showed no signs of abnormality. These behaviors were initially not perceived as a clear threat, as they could be masked by the notion of concern within marriage, but through overall evaluation, they revealed a systematic pattern of control, in which Sophia's personal autonomy was gradually eroded over time. The investigative agency noted that Adrian's suspicions were not based on objective evidence of infidelity or marital breaches, but stemmed from subjective inferences and imagined scenarios reinforced by the repeated control itself. Behavioral analysis showed that Adrian exhibited signs of pathological jealousy, a psychological state in which the fear of losing ownership over his spouse became the central focus of his thoughts and actions, leading to a need for total possession and control. Investigators assessed that the jealousy in this case was not an immediate reaction to a specific event, but an escalating process, in which each baseless suspicion was used to justify tightening control even further. The consequence of this process was the formation of an imbalanced relational structure where Adrian held decision-making and supervisory power, while Sophia was gradually pushed into a position of having to adapt, explain, and self-adjust her behavior to avoid conflict. In the motive evaluation process, the obsessive possession factor was identified as the core element, as Adrian's behavior indicated that the goal was not only to prevent imagined risks of betrayal, but also to establish absolute power within the relationship. From this perspective, the abduction and confinement were not viewed as an impulsive reaction, but as the next step in an escalating chain of control behaviors, where completely depriving Sophia of freedom became the ultimate means to maintain possession. Investigators also evaluated the punitive motive as a significant component, since isolating Sophia from the outside world served not only the need for control, but also carried a punitive element toward the baseless suspicions Adrian attributed to her. This punishment did not necessarily manifest through overt violence, but through restricting freedom, social isolation, and imposing a living environment where Sophia was stripped of the ability to make independent decisions. The analysis showed that victim isolation served a dual role, weakening the ability to seek external support, while reinforcing the perpetrator's sense of power in the private space. When linking this motive to the developments after Sophia's disappearance, the investigative agency observed a clear consistency between the control motive and the way Adrian handled the situation publicly and with authorities. His appearance in the role of a worried cooperative husband calling for searches was assessed as aligning with the goal of concealing the crime, while maintaining a social image that minimized suspicion, all while retaining actual control over Sophia. Investigators concluded that the motives of possession and punishment also explained how the confinement could continue for such a long time without detection, as it was carried out within the context of a marital relationship, where privacy and societal trust provided a natural shield. Connecting the motive to the entire sequence of events revealed a consistent behavioral pattern, from the pre-disappearance phase with signs of control and baseless suspicion, to the prolonged abduction and confinement, and finally, to maintaining the false scene of a disappearance. On that basis, the investigative agency determined that the criminal motive in this case did not stem from a single conflict or immediate event, but was the result of a prolonged psychological and behavioral process in which pathological jealousy, obsessive possession, the need for punishment, and strategies of victim isolation combined to form and sustain the criminal conduct, creating a consistent motivational foundation aligned with the entire sequence of events documented in the file. The process of reconstructing the abduction sequence focused on precisely determining the timing and circumstances under which the criminal act occurred, showing that the event did not stem from an unexpected situation or overt conflict, but took place within the familiar context of married life, when Sophia Bennett was in a state of complete trust and had no reason to be on guard. According to the established sequence, the act of restraint occurred at a time when no third party was present, with no external attention-drawing factors, and not coinciding with hours easily observable by neighbors or public surveillance systems. The choice of this timing allowed Adrian Petrov to exploit the advantage of private space and intimate relationship to approach Sophia without raising any suspicion. The method of restraint was identified as discreet and controlled, not involving loud violence or obvious injury, but relying on the element of surprise, psychological overwhelm, and the ability to paralyze the victim's response in a very short time. Investigators noted that the absence of signs of a struggle at the apartment aligned with the scenario in which Sophia was placed in a near-immediate state of inability to resist, with insufficient time or conditions to call for help, fight back, or create physical disturbance in the living space. After successfully restraining her, Adrian proceeded to move Sophia out of the residential area in a manner that attracted no attention, leveraging his familiarity with the surrounding daily rhythm and the typical movements of a married couple to disguise the abnormal nature of the action. This movement did not occur in a state of haste or chaos, but was carried out in a way that could easily be interpreted by outsiders as a normal activity, thereby minimizing the risk of being identified as a coercive situation. The investigative agency determined that the lack of direct witnesses to the abduction was not due to a lack of people around, but because the perpetrator had deliberately chosen a context and method that allowed the criminal act to blend seamlessly into everyday life. In parallel with removing Sophia from the residential area, Adrian took steps to ensure that the shared living space remained in its normal state, with no signs of intrusion or coercion, thereby creating a sufficiently convincing false scene to initially mislead authorities. This included not disturbing belongings, leaving no unusual physical traces, and maintaining a living context consistent with the scenario of Sophia leaving home under normal conditions. This stage scene played a key role in causing the initial inspection process to fail to detect criminal indicators, thereby steering the case toward an unexplained disappearance rather than an act of violence. After completing the movement and isolation of the victim, Adrian carried out the act of reporting to the police according to a pre-prepared script, choosing the timing of the call to fit the story of Sophia not returning and being unreachable. In this call, his voice was noted as trembling, expressing worry and anguish, consistent with the image of a husband in panic over his wife's sudden disappearance, thereby further reinforcing the plausibility of the previously staged false scene. The act of reporting to the police not only created an official timestamp for the disappearance, but also quickly positioned Adrian as the cooperative party, the affected party, and the one needing assistance, thereby reducing the likelihood of suspicion in the early stages. Investigators determined that the combination of discreet restraint, inconspicuous victim movement, staging a false scene, and proactively reporting to the police formed a continuous chain of actions, in which each step supported the next to conceal the true nature of the criminal conduct. Adrian's consistent appearance in the role of a worried, cooperative husband calling for searches was seen as an inseparable part of this plan, as it aligned with societal expectations and weakened the ability to question what had occurred in the private space beforehand. When cross-referencing the entire sequence of events, the investigative agency noted that the abduction bore no signs of impulsiveness or loss of control, but was the result of a prepared psychological and behavioral process in which the perpetrator exploited the intimate relationship, the privacy of family life, and societal norms to carry out the restraint, movement, and concealment of the victim, without leaving clear traces in the initial phase, thereby enabling the disappearance narrative to persist and be accepted for an extended period. After determining the sequence of the abduction and the initial concealment methods, the investigative agency shifted its focus to tracing the location where Sophia Bennett was held during the entire long period she was deprived of freedom, with the assumption that this place was outside the Miami Beach area, to minimize the risk of detection and to separate the victim from all familiar social connections. The tracing process was conducted by cross-referencing Sophia's confirmation statements, the recorded physical and psychological characteristics, along with a review of Adrian Petrov's activities, movements, and access to real estate in the period following Sophia's disappearance. Investigators concentrated on areas with natural isolation features, low population density, limited surveillance infrastructure, and minimal regular presence of outsiders, as these conditions were suitable for maintaining long-term confinement without attracting attention. Such locations are typically situated outside densely populated urban centers, possibly in outlying or semi-rural areas where an individual's activities are not easily monitored by neighbors or public camera systems. Analysis of Sophia's living conditions during the missing period showed that she had no access to the internet, a phone, or any form of external communication, suggesting that the confinement site had to enable absolute control over information, with no stable mobile signal, or designed to completely isolate the victim from ordinary communication channels. Experts assessed that maintaining information isolation over a prolonged period required not only a discrete physical space, but also an environment where the victim's absence would not be questioned by the surrounding community, such as sparsely trafficked residential areas or structures not tied to regular community life. Based on the recorded signs of prolonged exhaustion and restricted movement, the investigative agency determined that the confinement location had to allow tight control over Sophia's mobility, while not requiring constant guarding that could cause fatigue or expose the criminal behavior. This led to the assumption that the confinement space may have been designed or selected so that its physical structure itself limited the possibility of escape, reducing the need for overt coercive measures. Investigators also considered logistical factors, including the ability to provide food, water, and minimum living necessities without frequent interaction with others, since any unusual shopping or supply activities could increase the risk of detection. The complete absence of signs of social contact throughout Sophia's missing period indicated that the confinement site was not in a typical community living environment, but rather an isolated space where the presence of an additional person would not draw attention. When cross-referenced with Adrian's recorded schedule and activities during this period, the investigative agency paid attention to unexplained time gaps and travel segments, as well as his potential access to locations outside Miami Beach that he could use without raising suspicion. This allowed narrowing down several suspect areas based on criteria matching the requirements for isolation, limited information infrastructure, and the ability to sustain long-term confinement. Investigators noted that the confinement location did not necessarily have to be an abandoned facility or a completely uninhabited place, but could be a private space shielded by an outwardly normal appearance, where solitude and minimal interaction were seen as natural. These characteristics help explain why Sophia could be held for such a long time without leaving traces of contact with the outside world, and why there were no community reports of her unusual presence. The process of narrowing down suspect scenes was carried out based on the intersection of multiple factors, including the suspect's accessibility, the area's level of social isolation, limitations in information infrastructure, and compatibility with the victim's physical and psychological signs. This process did not aim to immediately identify a specific location, but to create a narrowed list of high-probability areas where environmental features aligned with prolonged undetected confinement. Investigators assessed that identifying the confinement site was a pivotal step, as it not only provided the physical context for the criminal acts, but also allowed linking the signs of exhaustion, isolation, and control that Sophia endured to a specific space, thereby creating a basis for continued tracing and verification of material elements related to the confinement throughout the period she was deprived of freedom. After the suspect location was identified and accessed, the crime scene examination was carried out with the objective of collecting physical traces that reflect the process of coerced living and the prolonged confinement conditions Sophia Bennett endured. Investigators focused on surveying the entire space, believed to be where the victim was held, paying particular attention to areas showing signs of frequent use, but lacking characteristics of a voluntary residence environment, including the abnormal distribution of sleeping areas, eating zones, and personal activity points clearly limited in space. These traces indicated that the victim's daily life occurred within a narrow repetitive range, with no ability to adjust according to personal needs, reflecting a state of control rather than free choice. During the examination, signs of coerced living were documented through uneven wear on floor surfaces, walls, and objects, showing the prolonged presence of one person under conditions where flexible movement was not permitted. Basic living items appeared with high frequency of use, but without signs of replacement, repair, or personalization, reinforcing the assessment that the victim had no access to or decision-making power over her living environment. In parallel, tools and control elements were documented as an important part of the scene, including structures or items designed to restrict access to exits, hinder movement, or create sufficiently strong psychological barriers to maintain compliance without the need for overt violence. These elements were not crude or easily identifiable, as in cases of violent confinement, but were discreetly integrated into the space, sufficient to sustain long-term control without drawing attention from an external observer. Evaluation of survival conditions at the scene showed that the confinement environment met only minimum needs to sustain life, with limited lighting, unstable ventilation, and low-level hygiene conditions unsuitable for prolonged healthy living. Investigators noted the complete absence of elements that create a sense of safety, privacy, or comfort, consistent with the physical exhaustion and psychological stress confirmed in the prior medical and psychological evaluations. Analysis of time-accumulated signs, including the degree of material wear, repeated use marks at certain fixed points, and degradation of frequently contacted surfaces, allowed for a relative estimation of the confinement duration, indicating this was not a short-term presence, but a prolonged process consistent with the period Sophia was considered missing. These estimates were cross-checked against the established timeline in the file to verify consistency between the scene and the relevant event milestones in the case. Another key focus of the crime scene examination was linking material elements to Sophia's confirmation statements, not to reenact her account in detail, but to assess the degree of alignment between the described experience and the actual conditions of the confinement space. Investigators noted that many features of the scene, from the restricted spatial layout and fixed activity points to signs of movement control, were compatible with the physical and psychological manifestations recorded after the victim's reappearance, thereby creating mutual support between physical evidence and prior assessments. The examination also concentrated on evaluating the feasibility of long-term human habitation in this space without attracting external attention, considering factors such as soundproofing levels, geographic location, frequency of passers-by, and the ability to conceal daily activities. The results showed that the scene possessed characteristics allowing prolonged confinement without generating abnormal signals to the surrounding community, explaining why there were no reports or signs of external intervention throughout the time Sophia was isolated. In the synthesis process, investigators assessed that the scene did not reflect a random or short-term act of violence, but demonstrated deliberate sustained control through the living environment, where restrictions were designed to become part of everyday routine, blurring the line between coercion and forced adaptation. It was precisely the combination of seemingly normal material elements, when viewed in totality, that provided evidence of a prolonged confinement structure in which the victim's freedom was stripped away through spatial, informational, and survival condition control. The crime scene examination results therefore played a pivotal role in reinforcing the determination that Sophia Bennett's confinement was not merely a single act, but a continuously maintained process, with physical traces clearly reflecting long-term presence, restricted movement, and coerced living conditions, creating a tight linkage between the scene, the medical psychological evaluations, and what had been established about the nature of the criminal conduct. The analysis of the control methods was conducted by cross-referencing the psychological and physical signs recorded in Sophia Bennett with the structure of the confinement environment identified at the scene, revealing that the criminal pattern did not rely on continuous physical violence, but on systematic psychological control, designed to maintain long-term power over the victim. Investigators determined that the limited use of overt violence was not a sign of reduced severity, but rather a deliberate strategy to avoid leaving easily detectable injuries while simultaneously weakening the victim's ability to resist through prolonged psychological erosion. In this model, control was established by manipulating perception, creating feelings of helplessness and dependence, causing the victim to gradually lose the ability to assess situations and trust her own judgment. A central element of the method was the complete isolation from information. Sophia was entirely cut off from external sources, with no access to the internet, telephone, or any means of communication that could help her maintain connection with the outside world. This isolation served not only to prevent calls for help, but also to disrupt the flow of feedback information that helps a victim maintain a sense of time, society, and self-positioning, thereby making her increasingly dependent on whatever the perpetrator allowed her to know or experience. Investigators noted that information control was carried out in parallel with spatial restriction, creating a closed environment where every stimulus could be adjusted to reinforce the feeling of captivity and no escape. In this context, systematic mental threats were used as a substitute for continuous violence, including implications of consequences for non-compliance, the creation of a sense of ever-present latent danger, and the maintenance of uncertainty about the victim's future. These threats did not necessarily have to be repeated verbally, but were often reinforced through behavior, environment, and unpredictable changes in treatment, keeping the victim in a constant state of high alertness and inability to predict what would happen next. Experts assessed that this very uncertainty played a pivotal role in eliminating resistance, as it prevented the victim from building stable coping strategies and forced her to focus on day-to-day adaptation to avoid risks. The control method also included gradually undermining the victim's autonomy through the imposition of rigid daily rules, limiting personal choices, and regulating behavior with psychological reward and punishment mechanisms, thereby creating a state of dependence in which the victim felt her existence and safety were entirely subject to the controller's will. In this state, resistance not only became dangerous, but also seemed meaningless, as every action was already placed within a pre-established control framework. The maintenance of dependence was further reinforced by prolonged social isolation, where the victim had no opportunity to validate her experiences with others, leading to the erosion of trust in reality and the ability to self-assess situations. Investigators noted that this model aligned with the complex PTSD manifestations identified in Sophia's psychological evaluation, particularly strong reactions to control elements, persistent feelings of insecurity, and difficulty making independent decisions, even after liberation. When viewed as a whole, the control methods did not appear as a series of disconnected acts, but as a continuously maintained system in which the confinement environment, information isolation, mental threats, and psychological manipulation interacted to create a state of prolonged abuse. Investigators determined that it was precisely the continuous and systematic nature of these methods that caused the victim profound psychological damage, despite the absence of frequent physical violence, and also explained why the confinement could last for such an extended period, without requiring overt violent intervention. Identifying the prolonged abuse pattern based on psychological control allowed the investigative agency to better understand the true nature of the criminal conduct, not merely as a simple deprivation of freedom, but as a comprehensive manipulation process aimed at breaking the victim's will and autonomy, thereby sustaining the perpetrator's power over a long period, without leaving easily identifiable signs of violence in the early stages. The impact of the prolonged confinement on Sophia Bennett was assessed as a cumulative chain of psychological and perceptual changes over time, beginning with the gradual erosion of her sense of time and space, and progressing to profound shifts in how she perceived herself and the world around her. Being isolated from familiar social time markers, no access to calendars, news, stable natural light, or normal daily rhythms, weakened Sophia's ability to orient herself in time, causing days, weeks and months to blend together without clear boundaries. This loss of temporal awareness was not merely a cognitive phenomenon, but directly affected her mental state, as the victim could not anticipate the future or envision an end to the confinement, thereby intensifying feelings of helplessness and despair. In parallel, the spatial restriction within a closed environment, lacking changes in scenery or sensory stimulation, distorted her perception of space, shrinking Sophia's world to a very narrow scope, where every movement and choice was controlled. These changes directly impacted her capacity for independent decision-making, as Sophia gradually lost the habit of evaluating options and consequences, replacing it with a reflex of adapting to imposed rules to avoid immediate risks. Over time, decision-making no longer stemmed from personal desires or values, but from anticipating the controller's reactions, leading to a severe decline in her sense of autonomy. This mechanism was reinforced by coerced survival dependence, where all basic needs, food, water, sleep, and safety, depended on the controller's permission or arrangement, causing Sophia to increasingly link her very survival to the captor's will. This dependence was not only material, but also psychological, as the victim was forced to maintain a state of compliance to secure minimum needs, thereby blurring the line between coercion and forced adaptation. According to expert evaluations, it was precisely this prolonged survival dependence that weakened the capacity for resistance even in thought, as any oppositional action was assessed by the brain as a direct threat to personal safety. Psychological damage in this context did not emerge suddenly, but accumulated gradually day by day, through repeated cycles of daily routine, where chronic stress, lack of control, and continuous social isolation kept the nervous system in a state of heightened vigilance. The result was the formation of complex trauma responses, including persistent baseline anxiety, difficulty relaxing, sleep disturbances, and a tendency to doubt one's own judgment. These damages were not easily visible in outward appearances, but manifested clearly in the way Sophia processed information, reacted to new situations, and interacted with others after her release. When linking these impacts to Sophia's behavior after reappearance, investigators and experts noted the consistency between the prolonged confinement experience and her cautious state, tightly controlled emotions, and high need for a sense of safety in every interaction. Her request to work directly with investigators in a closed space, her lack of initiative in contacting family, and her reserved demeanor toward unnecessary questions were seen as natural consequences of the extended loss of control when the victim learned to limit self-expression as a form of self-protection. Difficulties in sequencing events and making quick decisions were also directly tied to the diminished capacity for independent decision-making during confinement, when the brain had become accustomed to delaying or avoiding choices to reduce risk. Overall, these impacts demonstrate that prolonged confinement did not merely deprive physical freedom, but profoundly altered the victim's psychological and perceptual structure, leaving lasting consequences even after physical control had ended. Connecting the post-reappearance manifestations to these time-accumulated effects allowed authorities to better understand that Sophia's current state was not a transient reaction to trauma, but the result of a long process of autonomy deprivation where every small controlled element of daily life accumulated to create profound damages that must be viewed within the full context of the extended confinement she endured. Sophia Bennett's process of preparing to escape did not unfold as a plan formed in a single moment, but was the result of a prolonged chain of quiet, accumulated observation under conditions of strict control and complete survival dependence on Adrian Petrov. In her state of confinement, Sophia understood that any act of resistance carried direct risk to her own safety, so the first thing she did was not to attempt an immediate escape, but to observe the controller's daily rhythm with extreme patience and caution. These observations did not occur openly or in a clearly systematic way, but were accumulated through small everyday details, such as the times Adrian appeared and left, the periods when he interacted less, the level of attention he paid when entering the confinement space, as well as subtle shifts in his mood and behavior. Over time, Sophia realized that control was not always maintained at an absolute level, and that there were brief moments when Adrian's vigilance decreased, often tied to fatigue, distraction, or overconfidence in the established control system. These lapses in vigilance were not fixed or mechanically predictable, requiring Sophia to continuously update her assessments rather than rely on outdated assumptions. Throughout this phase, Sophia maintained an outward appearance of absolute compliance, showing no signs of opposition and making no behavioral changes that could arouse suspicion, because she understood that any unusual signal could lead to tightened control or psychological punishment, potentially eliminating the rare opportunities that had just begun to emerge. Preparation for resistance was therefore strictly limited to internal and cognitive actions, including mentally mapping the space, evaluating feasible movement paths, and visualizing action scenarios in her mind, without performing any physical tests that could be detected. Sophia had to account for the reality that her physical condition had deteriorated after the long period of confinement, leaving her endurance and physical reflexes no longer what they once were, so any action, if it occurred, had to be brief, decisive, and allow no margin for error. In parallel with observing and preparing, Sophia continuously assessed the risks of failure, a key factor in delaying the decision to act for an extended time. She was fully aware that if discovered during resistance, the consequences would not stop at losing the escape opportunity, but could lead to intensified control, deeper isolation, and more severe psychological punishment, nearly extinguishing any hope in the near future. This risk assessment was not theoretical, but nourished by direct experience of how Adrian reacted when he felt his control was threatened, making Sophia understand that failure would leave no room for a second mistake. In that context, the decision to act became a matter of survival, where Sophia had to balance the immediate fear of consequences against the desire to escape the prolonged confinement that had gradually eroded her will and personal identity. The choice of timing did not emerge as an impulsive moment, but formed when Sophia recognized a rare convergence of multiple factors: Adrian's reduced vigilance, environmental conditions that allowed quick action, and her own mental state sufficiently focused to make a firm decision. Selecting this timing reflected a significant shift in Sophia's psychology, from passive adaptation to calculated proactivity, though still severely constrained by the conditions of confinement. Throughout the entire preparation process, Sophia did not view escape as a heroic act or direct confrontation, but as a last resort choice to preserve her life and restore the minimum autonomy that had been stripped away for so long. Her prolonged caution, patience, and calculation showed that the escape preparation was not merely an action plan, but the outcome of profound psychological adaptation in an abusive environment, where every decision had to be weighed in a high-risk context with no opportunity for correction. The moment of Sophia Bennett's escape arrived, when the conditions she had quietly observed, memorized, and evaluated throughout her confinement converged at the lowest acceptable level of risk, tied to the rare moment when Adrian Petrov displayed an unusual lapse in the tightly maintained and repetitive control rhythm. In that circumstance, Sophia was fully aware that this opportunity was not repeatable, and that any hesitation could cause the entire control system to be re-established with greater severity, accompanied by consequences she had become all too familiar with over the long period. The act of resistance was carried out in an extremely short window, not aimed at prolonged confrontation or complete overpowering, but focused solely on temporarily disabling Adrian's ability to control her long enough to create a safe gap for departure. Sophia exploited the element of surprise, the close proximity, and Adrian's complacency in that moment of reduced vigilance to knock him unconscious, a survival-driven decision made after prolonged deliberation and only activated when she believed it was the least risky option among the dangerous possibilities that could arise. As soon as she sensed the control had been interrupted, Sophia did not pause to confirm or wait, because she understood that every passing second increased the chance of the situation reversing, and hesitation could cause the entire effort to collapse. She left the confinement space, following the route she had memorized during her prior observations, moving quickly but under control, avoiding any noise, collisions, or unusual signs that could attract attention from the surrounding environment. The escape from the confinement site occurred in a state of extreme tension, as her body had to fight against accumulated exhaustion from the long period, while maintaining the necessary alertness to handle each emerging situation in a very short time. Sophia took no personal belongings or unnecessary items with her, as speed and discretion were given absolute priority over everything else. Once she crossed the immediate boundary of the confinement space, she continued to move away from the surrounding area without slowing down, fully aware that the greatest risk lay not in the moment of knocking Adrian out, but in the time immediately afterward, when the possibility of being discovered, pursued, or dragged back still existed. In a state of high adrenaline, Sophia maintained continuous movement until she felt a sufficient distance had been created to reduce the immediate risk of detection, even as her body kept signaling fatigue and stress. Leaving the confinement area was not supported by a complete logistical plan, but relied entirely on whatever means and opportunities were available in the moment, forcing Sophia to make instantaneous decisions based on instinct, observational experience, and the goal of blending into normal daily rhythms to avoid drawing attention. She chose common, non-personalized means of transportation, utilizing routes that allowed her to merge into crowds or everyday activities, thereby reducing the chance of being identified as an unusual situation. The journey back to Miami was not only a geographic trip, but also a continuous chain of psychological adjustments, as Sophia had to suppress the fear of being discovered, control panic reactions, and maintain enough clarity to handle emerging situations, while her physical condition remained heavily affected by prolonged exhaustion. She avoided unnecessary contact, limited communication, and did not seek help from strangers, because any delay or unwanted attention could increase the risk during this sensitive phase. Upon returning to Miami, Sophia did not seek temporary shelter, attempt to contact acquaintances, or try to recover her strength first, because she understood that true safety could only be ensured once the matter was placed under the official protection of authorities. The decision to approach the police directly reflected a clear shift in her psychology, from a state of having to hide, comply and survive in silence, to one of actively seeking intervention from the legal system. When she entered the police headquarters, Sophia was in a state of physical exhaustion, but mental focus, prioritizing the establishment of her identity, and requesting to work directly with investigators rather than immediately recounting the entire story. The sequence of actions, from the moment she knocked Adrian unconscious, left the confinement site, moved continuously to create a safe distance, returned to Miami, and approached authorities, occurred in a short span of clock time, but was the result of a prolonged quiet preparation, extended risk assessment, and powerful activation of survival instinct, marking the real end of the period of control, and opening an entirely different phase in Sophia Bennett's life. The process of cross-referencing statements and evidence was carried out systematically right after Sophia Bennett had stabilized physically and psychologically to a level that allowed extended work sessions with the goal of checking consistency between what she presented and all the objective data collected during the file reactivation phase. Sophia's statements were structured chronologically and spatially, separating each specific phase to avoid overlap, thereby enabling investigators to compare each detail directly with the previously examined confinement scene. Her descriptions of the spatial layout, restricted activity areas, entry and exit points, and control checkpoints were compared straight against the physical traces collected at the scene, including surface wear levels, abnormal distribution of items, and movement-restricting elements. The match between her statements and the scene did not appear in a single detail, but manifested through multiple independent points of intersection, creating a level of consistency that would be difficult to explain by random coincidence. In parallel with the scene cross-referencing, movement data related to Adrian Petrov, during the period Sophia was considered missing, was reviewed and placed alongside the timelines Sophia provided, showing significant compatibility and activity gaps, unexplained trips, and shifts in movement patterns compared to the prior period. This data, when compared with Sophia's descriptions of being taken out of the residential area and held at an isolated location, formed a continuous logical chain between the victim's experience and objective technical traces. Physical evidence collected from the scene, including signs of prolonged habitation, control-oriented tools, and information isolation elements, was cross-referenced with Sophia's statements about the methods used to maintain confinement, showing alignment in function and usage duration, further bolstering the reliability of her account. During this process, investigators did not only seek matches, but actively scrutinized potential points of contradiction to test the stability of the statements, thereby determining that any minor discrepancies, if present, fell within limits explainable by psychological effects and the prolonged confinement period, without altering the core nature of the events. In contrast to the relative stability of Sophia's statements, Adrian Petrov's statements, during the same phase, revealed clear contradictions when placed against objective data and physical evidence. Differences in timing of appearances, travel routes, purposes of trips, and level of contact with suspect areas emerged when Adrian's statements were compared with technical data, creating systematic mismatches rather than random errors. Investigators noted that these contradictions tended to increase as questions delved deeper into details, and Adrian's narrative often shifted in response to new information clarified by the investigative agency, showing signs of adjusting statements to adapt to investigative developments. When these contradictions were placed in the context of Sophia's consistent statements and their alignment with the scene, they became a key factor in strengthening the accusatory axis. The cross-referencing process also extended to other indirect data, such as activity schedules, public behavior, and Adrian's earlier statements during Sophia's missing period, revealing incompatibility between the initially constructed image of a worried husband and the control behaviors identified after the file was reopened. These elements, when connected, formed a continuous chain of evidence, in which each link was independently verified while simultaneously supporting the others, significantly reducing the viability of reasonable alternative hypotheses. The strengthening of the accusatory file, therefore, did not rely on a single piece of evidence or an isolated statement, but on the convergence of multiple diverse data sources, from the victim's statements, scene evidence, movement data, to the internal contradictions in the suspect's account. Once the evidence chain was completed, the investigative agency achieved a consistent picture of the case developments, in which Adrian Petrov's role was established, not only through Sophia's accusations, but through the alignment between objective evidence and the increasingly evident inconsistencies in his own explanations. This process reflected an investigative method centered on verification, cross-referencing, and elimination of discrepancies, ensuring that conclusions were built on a solid foundation of data, capable of withstanding rigorous legal scrutiny, and not dependent on emotional factors or speculation. Sophia Bennett's confession was recorded as a continuous, unbroken narrative, constructed through multiple consecutive working sessions, yet maintaining unity in structure, sequence, and focus, allowing the investigative agency to reconstruct the entire course of events from the victim's direct perspective, without needing to patch together speculation. In this statement, Sophia begins from the moment her freedom was taken, describing in detail how the abduction did not occur through overt violence or coercion in a crowded place, but was carried out through the trust inherent in married life, where initial control behaviors were disguised as care, concern, and protection. She clarifies how Adrian gradually narrowed her living space, controlled her schedule, reduced her social connections, and adjusted her daily rhythm, making the transition from normal life to confinement happen quietly but decisively. Sophia describes the early phase of confinement as a series of days where the boundary between voluntary and coerced was blurred, as personal choices were gradually eliminated rather than immediately stripped away, making resistance difficult to pinpoint in both timing and form. The sequence of control she presents is not portrayed as impulsive acts, but as a structured system in which living environment, information, and sense of safety were all adjusted to maintain dependence. Sophia delves into describing the life or death decisions she was forced to make under those conditions, including choosing silence in the face of control behaviors to avoid escalation of punishment, maintaining outward compliance to preserve her physical strength, and accepting severe restrictions as a temporary survival strategy. She does not shy away from acknowledging that during many phases, her top priority was not immediate escape, but surviving day by day, keeping herself sufficiently alert and healthy so as not to completely lose the capacity to act in the future. In the confession, Sophia explains how she had to continuously adjust her perception to cope with the loss of time awareness, how days and months blended together in the closed environment, and how she broke experiences into short markers to avoid being overwhelmed by hopelessness. She details the formation of psychological reflexes aimed at avoiding risk, where every resistant thought was carefully weighed against the danger of consequences, and how survival dependence forced her to evaluate every decision through the lens of immediate safety rather than long-term freedom. When moving to the phase of preparing to escape, Sophia explains clearly that the decision to resist did not stem from a sudden burst of courage, but from a prolonged accumulation of observation, where she identified patterns of control behavior, rare moments of reduced vigilance, and environmental factors that could create action gaps. She does not avoid describing in detail the decision to knock Adrian unconscious as a life or death choice made in a context with no lower risk options, and she clarifies that the sole purpose of that action was to create enough time to leave, not to confront or seek revenge. Sophia continues to present the escape sequence with focus on instantaneous survival-driven decisions, from leaving the confinement site in silence, prioritizing speed and discretion, to choosing common means of transportation, to blend into normal activity, and reduce the chance of being identified. In her statement, she explains the reason for not seeking temporary shelter or contacting acquaintances, instead choosing direct approach to authorities, as the only way to completely end the state of control and ensure long-term safety. The entire confession is presented without avoidance or downplaying of details, even those that could be controversial or raise difficult questions, because Sophia determined that clarifying the truth was more important than protecting her personal image. The consistency in her statement is evident in the logical ordering of event milestones, aligning with the data and evidence previously cross-referenced, creating a stable axis of truth, where each decision and action is placed within the specific context of prolonged confinement. This confession does not aim to dramatize the experience, but serves as a comprehensive account in which the sequence of abduction, confinement, control, and escape is connected by clear causal relationships, explaining why the case could continue undetected for so long, and why Sophia's return was decisive in reversing all initial assumptions. By maintaining continuity, not shying away from details, and anchoring her statement tightly to verified reality, Sophia's confession locks in the factual axis of the case, eliminating the possibility of reasonable alternative interpretations, and providing a solid foundation for correctly understanding the nature of what occurred throughout the period she was deprived of freedom. The prosecution process against Adrian Petrov was initiated after the investigative agency and the prosecutor's office determined that the entire file had reached a level of completeness, consistency, and sufficiency to meet the strict evidentiary standards of the criminal justice system, allowing the focus to shift from verifying the facts to establishing individual legal responsibility. Adrian's arrest was carried out in accordance with procedural sequence, based on a comprehensive assessment that the defendant played a central role in the chain of prolonged abduction and unlawful confinement acts, while there existed a real risk of influencing evidence, indirectly impacting the victim, or obstructing the legal process if preventive measures were not applied promptly. The criminal charges announced fully reflected the serious, organized, and prolonged nature of the criminal conduct, including abduction, unlawful confinement, coercion, and severe control within the marital relationship, with the legal focus placed on the deprivation of personal freedom, violation of dignity, and the profound long-term psychological harm inflicted on the victim. During the preparation of the prosecution file, prosecutors concentrated on proving the intentional element and the continuity of the conduct, making clear that this was not the result of a temporary family conflict or an impulsive emotional reaction, but a deliberately sustained process of control, with preparation regarding space, confinement conditions, and concealment strategies. The prosecution file was structured along a tight chronological axis, linking each phase of abduction, confinement, control, and escape to corresponding evidence, including Sophia Bennett's consistent statements, movement data, crime scene examination results, medical and psychological evaluations, as well as the increasingly evident contradictions in Adrian Petrov's statements. A key point in the prosecution strategy was to minimize reliance on the trauma-affected testimony of the victim, instead emphasizing objective evidence that had been independently verified and capable of standing on its own in litigation, to prevent the file from being weakened by arguments attacking the victim's psychological state. Adrian's legal response during this phase showed a clear shift from an outward cooperative attitude to a strategically defensive posture, as the defendant limited statements to the maximum extent, refused to provide further detailed testimony, and delegated all legal interactions to his representing attorney. These moves were recorded by the prosecuting authority as part of legitimate defense rights, but were simultaneously placed within the overall context of the case, particularly when compared to prior statements and the contradictions established during the investigation. While the defense side focused on protecting legal interests and preparing counter-arguments, the prosecution continued to review, systematize, and streamline the file to ensure that every piece of evidence had a clear position in the accusatory argument chain, avoiding duplication, contradiction, or interpretive gaps. This preparation work placed particular emphasis on presenting legal concepts related to psychological control and confinement without continuous physical violence, concepts that could easily be downplayed or misunderstood if not placed in the full context of expert evaluations and investigative practice. The transfer of the case to the trial phase marked the official end of the investigation and prosecution process, while opening a legal space where all evidence would be publicly examined, cross-examined, and evaluated according to litigation standards. The prosecution phase therefore carried not only procedural significance, but also demonstrated the clear stance of the justice system in addressing acts of freedom deprivation that occur quietly within the family sphere, where power and dependence are exploited to sustain prolonged control without the need for frequent physical violence. Bringing Adrian Petrov to prosecution reflects the view that sophisticated yet continuous forms of control still constitute serious crimes when they infringe upon personal freedom, dignity, and psychological safety, while affirming the role of the law in identifying, naming, and addressing such conduct fully and rigorously before moving to the formal trial phase. The trial process of Adrian Petrov was conducted in full compliance with criminal procedural sequence, reflecting the exceptional seriousness and complexity of the case, as the alleged acts did not merely involve deprivation of physical freedom, but encompassed a prolonged, sophisticated, and deliberate system of psychological control. Throughout the trial sessions, the panel of judges thoroughly examined the complete file built during the investigation and prosecution phases, including Sophia Bennett's continuous and stable testimony, medical and psychological evaluation results, showing signs of long-term confinement, movement data, and the defendant's behavior during the period the victim was considered missing, along with physical evidence collected from the confinement scene. The court devoted considerable time to analyzing the legal nature of confinement that did not rely on frequent physical violence, making clear that the use of psychological control, information isolation, manipulation of the living environment, and maintenance of survival dependence still constituted abduction and unlawful confinement under criminal law, even though the form differed from traditional violent models. The defense's arguments attempted to reframe the case as a dysfunctional marital relationship, claiming the defendant had no initial criminal intent, and emphasizing the absence of severe acute injuries at the time of the victim's reappearance. However, these arguments did not hold up when viewed against the overall body of evidence demonstrating preparation, continuity, and intentional maintenance of control over an extended period. The panel noted that staging a false scene, reporting the disappearance with a worried tone to mislead the investigation, along with maintaining an isolated confinement location and completely eliminating the victim's access to the outside world, clearly demonstrated awareness of concealing the crime and efforts to evade legal responsibility from the outset. In its conclusion, the court emphasized that this case could not be evaluated as a family dispute or an emotionally impulsive act, because the entire sequence of events showed a stable, sustained system of control over time, causing the victim to lose decision-making capacity, be deprived of freedom, and suffer severe accumulated psychological damage. Aggravating factors considered by the court included the prolonged duration of confinement, the degree of imposed survival dependence, the exploitation of the marital relationship to create a legal facade for criminal conduct, as well as the long-term impact on the victim's physical and psychological health, particularly the manifestations of complex trauma and diminished autonomy after liberation. On the basis of a comprehensive evaluation of those factors, the panel reached its final verdict, finding Adrian Petrov guilty of serious criminal offenses related to abduction, prolonged unlawful confinement, and systematic coercion, and imposing a combined sentence of 42 years imprisonment. This sentence was determined not only to punish the individual defendant, but also to reflect the court's view that acts of freedom deprivation concealed under the guise of romantic or marital relationships are especially dangerous, as they undermine the victim's ability to defend herself and seek help over a long period, while significantly complicating detection and intervention by authorities. The court also explicitly declared that Adrian Petrov was not eligible for early parole consideration, based on the assessment of his level of dangerousness, the lack of genuine acknowledgement of responsibility, and the risk of reoffending in controlling behavior if released early. The decision to deny early parole was made after reviewing the psychological file, the defendant's attitude throughout the proceedings, and the systematic nature of the criminal conduct, indicating that maximally restricting the possibility of returning to society was necessary to protect the community and prevent similar acts. This verdict officially closed the legal phase of the case, marking the conclusion of a prolonged investigation, prosecution and trial process in which the truth was established through objective evidence, verified through litigation, and publicly evaluated in court. The end of the legal phase carried not only procedural significance, but also affirmed the clear stance of the justice system that personal freedom is inviolable, and any form of prolonged control aimed at depriving that freedom, even when disguised by affection, duty, or marriage, will be addressed with correspondingly severe punishments when brought to light. Sophia Bennett's current condition is recorded as a functionally stable state that formed after the entire legal process officially concluded and direct threats to her personal safety no longer existed, but this does not in any way mean full recovery or a return to her pre-incident baseline. Sophia did not resume her old life in a seamless continuation, but entered a prolonged phase of restructuring her personal existence, where every choice is now carefully weighed in light of the deep imprint left by the experiences of control and freedom deprivation. Post-trial medical and psychological evaluations show that she maintains the ability to live independently, self-care, manage finances, and participate in daily life activities, yet a persistent high baseline state of vigilance remains, along with strong defensive reflexes in situations that evoke surveillance, loss of control, or isolation. These psychological consequences do not manifest as continuous crises or overt breakdowns, but accumulate quietly over time, appearing as episodic sleep disturbances, difficulty fully relaxing, prolonged mental fatigue, and a tendency to tightly control her surrounding environment as a self-protective mechanism formed during the confinement period. Sophia continues to engage in long-term psychological support programs, not with the goal of erasing traumatic memories, but focused on learning to manage their impact, re-establishing an internal sense of safety, and gradually restoring trust in her own independent decision-making ability. Experts describe this process as non-linear, with periods of progress interspersed with plateaus or reactivation of memories, requiring patience and acceptance that recovery in the context of prolonged trauma is a process of living with the injury rather than completely eliminating it. Socially, Sophia has actively adjusted her circle of interaction, narrowing her relationships to individuals and environments that provide a sense of safety, respect personal boundaries, and do not place her in a position of having to explain or justify her experience. This choice does not reflect withdrawal from society, but is a necessary adaptive strategy to protect her recovery process, since prolonged attention, curiosity, or external judgment can inadvertently recreate feelings of privacy violation. Sophia's reintegration therefore proceeds at a pace she herself determines, accepting that maintaining distance from certain social spaces is essential to preserve psychological stability. At the community level, the case has created a broad and lasting impact, forcing many individuals and organizations to confront the reality that severe freedom deprivation and abuse do not necessarily manifest through obvious physical violence or dramatic, easily recognizable signs. The exposed truth has sparked extensive discussions about psychological control in family relationships, about subtle warning signs often overlooked, and about the community's responsibility not to dismiss unusual behaviors simply because they do not fit familiar images of violence. The case has become an important reference point in training and awareness programs, helping to promote adjustments in protocols for receiving, assessing, and handling missing persons cases or suspected prolonged abuse, in order to reduce the risk of similar situations continuing to be hidden in silence. For the justice system and related agencies, the case file was officially closed once the sentence took full effect, and no legal proceedings remained pending, marking the irreversible end of a multi-phase protracted prosecution process. However, this closure holds only legal significance because the personal and social consequences left by the case cannot be closed by an administrative decision or court ruling. The aftermath of the case continues to exist in Sophia's life as an inseparable part of her memory, requiring active, conscious, and long-term management rather than any expectation that time alone will erase all wounds. The experiences of control, isolation, and deprivation of autonomy have reshaped how Sophia perceives safety, trust, and relationships, forcing her to build a new reality based on greater caution and deeper understanding of personal boundaries. In this context, recovery is not defined as returning to the starting point, but as the ability to establish a different state of balance, where autonomy is partially restored and a sense of safety is reinforced through accumulated experience rather than naive trust. On a broader level, the case has left an enduring mark on community awareness, serving as a reminder that justice can arrive late but still has the capacity to be enforced when truth is grounded in solid evidence, while also showing that the price victims pay does not end with the sentence imposed on the perpetrator. That aftermath exists as a warning about quiet forms of abuse, where power is maintained through manipulation and isolation rather than overt violence, and about the need for collective vigilance so that such behaviors are not normalized or overlooked. For Sophia Bennett, the present is not defined by forgetting the past, but by the ability to continue living alongside that memory without letting it dominate her entire life, accepting that some wounds do not disappear but can be managed, that safety is an active process rather than a static state, and that survival itself has been a resilient and quiet form of affirmation in the face of what happened. The story of Sophia Bennett is not just a personal tragedy, but also clearly reflects very real challenges in contemporary American life, where violence and control do not always take the form of fists or visible wounds. In this story, Sophia was not abducted on the street or locked in a room chained with iron. She was confined through baseless suspicion, through psychological control, through isolation from information and the outside world, by the very husband she trusted. This is a crucial detail, because it shows that the greatest danger sometimes comes from the relationships society views as the safest: marriage, family, love. The first lesson drawn is that in the United States, a country that highly values individual freedom, we need to learn to recognize early signs of control when someone constantly monitors your schedule, cuts off relationships, controls information, and gradually causes you to lose the ability to make your own decisions. That is no longer care, it is a sophisticated form of violence. The second lesson lies in the response of the system and the community. Sophia's file was once archived as a cold case, showing that if society only looks for clear signs of violence, many victims will be overlooked. This reminds American citizens that listening, believing, and supporting victims is a collective responsibility, not just that of police or courts. Finally, Sophia's survival journey shows that recovery is not about forgetting, but about learning to live on with the memory, setting boundaries, and reasserting one's own freedom. In a society that prizes independence like the United States, the deepest lesson from this story is freedom does not exist naturally. It must be protected, in the law, in the community, and in our closest relationships. If Sophia Bennett's story has made you reflect on freedom, boundaries, and the hidden corners of relationships that seem safe, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue listening to and understanding more deeply the true stories behind the verdicts. Thank you for watching until the very end, and see you in the next video with another journey where the truth always needs to be told.